today is a grief transformation expert, having had major encounters of her own loss with two of her former husbands and other family members, and having learned to face life with love, optimism, and joy. She teaches writing and is the author of her book, Loving and Living Your Way Through Grief. Today's guest is Emily Thiroux Threatt. Welcome, Emily.
Aloha, I'm happy to be here.
Me too. It's nice to have you here. Uh, as we transform through these times, many people who are faced with a lot of fear and either dealing with the fear, going inward, or going outward and getting caught up in everything that exists outside of themselves. Um, as we go through life, one of the questions I've always asked myself, which happened when I was probably in my teens, when my uncle passed away, I was thought life was endless and joyous, and there was no ending to anybody's life, especially at an early age when you're in your teenage years. And then when my uncle passed away, I actually at that age questioned what life was about. So it brought me to a place of questioning my own mortality at a very early age. And having gone through this journey, I've come across people like yourself who have the insight and wisdom and experience to expand upon what these incidents that we go through really bring about and what the major transformation or outcome that we can get out of it. So maybe you can share with the audience a little bit about your background in terms of how you came to this place of writing about grief.
Okay. I've had an awful lot of grief in my lifetime. Lots from about anything that you can think of somebody dying from. I've experienced that. Everything from murder, suicide, car accidents, cancer, heart attacks, brain tumors, all kinds of things. And they were very close people to me that all these things happened to. And I had to learn how to kind of deal with it at a young age. I was even younger than you when my dad bought an ambulance company. And back in those days, the regulations were really different than they are now. And you only had to be 14 years old and have an advanced first aid certificate to be an ambulance attendant. And so when I turned 14, I was an ambulance attendant because it was a small family business. And I started dealing with death. My very first call that I went on my birthday when I was 14. And it was an infant.
Wow.
And there was a massive head-on collision between two cars out in the country. Two families, whole families were in each of the cars, and there were multiple fatalities. But I happened to be, it was like I was an extra person on the call because they knew they were anticipating a lot. And so they just handed the baby to me, and I sat and just felt the baby's life go away on the way into the hospital. And it really made me question my mortality at that point. Like, what is life? How long do we get? What are we supposed to do? Made me, I think, value my life more and pay more attention to the decisions that I made in how I lived my life from then on. And I can't, I'm not a religious person. I was raised in a church and had many church experiences through my life, but most of them didn't work for me because I was dealing with people as opposed to the concept of love and what I see spirituality to be all about. So I consider myself to be a spiritual person. And my last husband, who died, was a religious science minister, and I learned a lot through him. And I've come from that we learned, or I learned, to live in the moment. So I pay attention to what's right now because we have no idea what's going to happen even in the next moment. And so I've learned to enjoy my moments. And that's allowed me to deal a lot better with my grief, especially with my two husbands. Because as much as I knew both of them were going to die, they both happened to die of the same thing. And when I married the second one, I had no idea that he was going to have the same thing that my other husband had had. But I needed to be able to deal with it in some way. And I'm a writer. I have taught writing at the university level for many years, still do, written college textbooks. So when my husband died, I started writing about it, because writing helped me explore my thoughts and my feelings about what was happening, what I anticipated happening, what I wanted to do, and really what my relationships were with my husband's. And doing that, I was able to get a lot of comfort through the writing. I wasn't writing for anybody else to read it. I was just writing to explore my feelings for myself, and it helped me a lot. And so I invited people to come over to my house, and we started writing together, and they loved it. And we did that. We started out once a month, and they said, we've got to meet more often. So we started going to every other week. And then the pandemic happened. So we couldn't get together in person, and the people weren't particularly computer people and couldn't get the gist of, or have access to a computer to write with. So I started figuring out what else I could do. And in the meantime, I wrote my book, and I wrote my book because I had read so many books dealing with grief, thinking that I was going to find help there. And I found that most of the books that I read were memoirs, were stories of somebody's experience with grief, experience with the death of a loved one, whether it be a child or a parent or a spouse or a friend, and what happened to them through that process. And although the stories were heartbreaking a lot of the times,
Right.
there was some hope in them, and it was worth reading. I'm glad I read them, but I wasn't finding help there. And so when I wrote my book, I wanted it to be something that could actually help people. So each of the chapters is on a different subject, all having to do with experiences you have when you've lost someone you love. And at the end of every chapter, there's an activity that you can do. There's something that you can do to actually try this out and see how you can incorporate it into your life. And I've had just wonderful responses from that people that said they're so grateful that somebody's giving them something to do instead of just sit and think about the problem, but be able to really put something into action that can help them to feel better.
Yeah. What's interesting is after interviewing numerous people, it's always a specific theme or a reoccurring incidents or energies that take over, or in order to wake either the person up or to have a life-altering experience to change the person's soul plan or awaken them. And I know for myself, having suffered a little bit physically with certain things, you question then, okay, so do we are we fearful of dying? Because if we're fearful of dying, we're really fearful of living. And that once we put an end, that we know that there's an end, we can actually say to ourselves that we might as well live from the time we're here till the time we're going to pass on. And I think many of us don't do that. When it comes to the subject of grieving and loss, people try to avoid the subject because it's much too painful for them to deal with. But yet you were faced with this numerous times. Did you look at it as if it was an awakening for you to focus in on that subject and what you can get out of it at some point?
Well, initially, my earlier experiences with loss, I was part of that fear thing going on. I really, many philosophers say that there are only two real emotions in life. One is love and the other one is fear. And you can have both of them. But once I finally figured that out, I decided to not stay in that fear place. And I can't say that I really experience fear anymore, because I work my way through anything and approach everything with love. So once I got to that point, things didn't matter to me in the same way they used to. Like right now, at this point in my life, with all I've been through, I can honestly say I'm happier now than I ever was. And I think I'm that because I focus on love, unconditional love for everybody, everything, every place. And that kind of eliminates fear from your life. And that way you can be happy, and you're not worried, if someone dies or something happens. You can be sad. I have a friend right now who is dealing with terminal metastatic cancer. And it of course makes me sad, and I will miss her. And I do what I can now to have precious moments with her while I can. So I'm not feeling fear doesn't mean that you don't get sad. I was definitely sad after both of my husbands died, significantly sad, but that gradually got better.
I was gonna say that that grief itself isn't just categorized into death. I mean,
Hmm.
we grieve relationships, we grieve divorce, we grieve separation from our family. Um, Getting back to again, I could just use myself as an example. I remember first of all my uncle passing away, and then going through different experiences. And I guess divorce was a major grieving process for me. And I know you speak about grieving. Like many people sometimes seek the afterlife as a solace for their loss, knowing that from the experiences of people who've had near death experiences and share their insight of what they saw and what they were told. Most of them come back with a different outlook on life and again live life to the fullest, knowing that there is life after this. So that makes it very interesting for me. And your work is insightful because it gives a foundation for people to grieve in the here and now in terms of how to handle grieving and the steps to grieve. I know, I think it's Kubler-Ross who has the different steps of grieving. Am I correct? Is it Kubler-Ross? I may be
Well,
wrong.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book in I think early 70s that was called On Death and Dying.
Right.
And in that book, she gave the 5 stages of dying,
Right.
not of grieving.
Okay.
Sorry. And people, there hadn't been anything really widely accepted on how to deal with grief. And people just kind of took those 5 stages and morphed it into saying that it's the 5 stages of grief. And I don't believe it is. When I
Right.
was
Right.
doing the research for my book, I found everything from 3 stages to like 12 stages, and there's no order. And I believe there aren't any specific stages. There are things that you may experience and you may not experience them. So you don't have to follow a certain prescription to get through.
Right.
And another thing that now people are identifying grief as a like an illness. The way they category things for payment from health insurance just changed this year. It said that if you're still grieving after a year, then that's this medical category that can be billed. And that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I believe when you're grieving like a loved one, someone you loved, I believe they're in your heart for as long as you're here and probably beyond. So if you're trying to get over grief, that chances are that's not going to happen. And if you just push it aside, you're kind of hiding it rather than dealing with it. So I think it's important to deal with any kind of loss, like you mentioned, divorce. Recently, we've all suffered loss in some form from the pandemic. Um, with the war in Ukraine right now, we're kind of vicariously experiencing the incredible loss that's going on in that part of the world. It just kind of ripples out around the world. You can't avoid it when there's that intensity of loss.
Yeah.
Um, you could have your cat die and it could be catastrophic to you. You know, it just depends on what it is. So we all are dealing with loss and grief in one way or another all the time, and it's how you choose to deal with it on how well your life is going to go. And you
Right.
can take charge. You can find things that can help you and can support you. And the afterlife question that you were asking about, lots of people just firmly believe in that. I recently was able to talk to Dr. Eben Alexander, who wrote
Yes.
the book Proof of Heaven.
Yes.
And he was a neurosurgeon who was in a coma for a week and was not expected to live or have any brain function if he did live. And when he did and got to be going back to being a neurosurgeon, his perspective on everything changed. And he really has been supporting and dealing with getting neurosurgeons in particular and doctors into this awareness of consciousness. And I think it's the consciousness, we think of a person as being a body, and in the afterlife, that body's not there anymore. So essentially what is left is consciousness, and your consciousness is what goes on.
Right. I interviewed Dr. Alexander and also Raymond
Oh, do
Moody.
you too?
Yeah, Raymond Moody spoke about actually in his earlier days that when he had meetings, people would show up to discuss near-death experiences, and most of them were doctors who shared their experiences with patients and they themselves what they experienced, which they wouldn't reveal to the people in the hospital or the people they were working with. So it was very interesting. So when I interviewed Dr. Alexander, and he shared the same kind of verbiage of what he experienced as well. Um, I guess the apprehension of believing in something thereafter, or as you said, the consciousness is still available. It's not separate from the mind. Um,
Yeah.
as you've gone through your own personal grieving and you've written your book, have you been aware of the steps or the emotions or what to look out for? Be it that you've experienced this numerous times. In other words, has it been easier for you to be able to grieve, knowing what comes next, or is each grieving a different experience?
That's it. Every situation with grief is a different experience, and it depends on your relationship with what or who you're grieving, um, how intense the situation is. Um, like the people I knew who were murdered weren't like close friends; they were more of acquaintances. But it affected me deeply because um, I knew them as acquaintances, and one moment they're there and the next minute they're not, and that caused a lot of thought and a lot of dealing with that, and it also allowed me to recognize the preciousness of life, and about spending time with who I love and saying anything that needs to be said, not holding things back, thinking that you'll deal with it later or you talk about it another time.
Yeah. How did you shift from fear to a love-based mindset?
Mostly by learning to live in the moment. Because when you're worried about what happened in your past and how it affects you, or you're concerned about what may happen in your future, then you're not dealing with right now. And you can have catastrophes in your past, and you may have catastrophes in your future, but you can also have incredible love and beauty and joy in your future. And you're more likely to get that love, beauty, and joy when that's what you're focusing on. If you're always talking about just loss and how sad that is, then that's where you'll stay.
So, yeah.
And with both husbands, I spent a time, at least a month with both of them, where I was kind of in a whole different perspective. I wasn't really talking to people. I wasn't happy. Wasn't particularly sad, but I did cry a lot. I didn't know what to do. I didn't care whether I ate or not. I didn't care whether I moved or not. I didn't want to deal with people or being around people. And when I got to the point where I sort of started to feel like I could breathe again, I started having this idea that I had to focus on something positive. And once I started doing that and realizing that I had the rest of my life to live, both my husbands were very positive people. They were very, very happy. Jacques laughed a lot, and we had a cockatiel that was supposed to talk, but all it did was Jacques laugh. Sometimes I'd think he was home because I'd hear him laughing in the other room, and so that was that joy in my life. And after he was gone, I could hear that laugh and still be cheered up by that. And with Ron, he just had the most beautiful smile, and he was so positive. And when I would start to feel down or something, I would go, you know what? Neither one of them would want me to not be happy and not make the most of this life experience that I have left to live. And so by really believing that, I was able to shift my focus on to, instead of sitting and being sad or being quiet or not relating to people, it shifted in a way that I could start reaching out, that I could do things that I knew would bring me pleasure. And sometimes that's through serving someone else, like inviting complete strangers over to my house to write about grief. We formed such a special bond because we all had something in common, and we all felt good. We smiled a lot at those. And you'd think, I know my perception before in the few grief groups that I had tried to go to, they were sad and people sat around and cried. And I thought, I don't want to absorb all this stuff. That's not what I can handle at this point. But
Right.
in our group where we were writing and then talking about what we wrote, we were able to focus on the love and the joy and the beauty of the relationships that we had with the people that weren't with us anymore. And that really helped a lot.
Yeah, it's what's interesting is usually when we're under stress, the first place we go is the past or the future, and
Mhm.
we leave the here and now, not being present. But I know through your experiences, I guess the grieving process requires us to go to our heart and stay present. And I know one of the ways I was listening to other interviews was a way for you to do it was through journaling, I guess, to express your
Oh,
feelings.
yes.
Yeah, maybe you could just elaborate on the significance of journaling and what it does for emotions or a person.
Journaling to me is indispensable. I can't imagine going a day without it. The first thing I do in the morning when I wake up, before I do anything else, is write in my journal. And I write at least 3 pages. And I got that number from a book called The Artist's Way, that it helps people with creativity and didn't have anything to do with grief. But I could see how her suggestion of starting out with that every day is extremely popular. That book is extremely popular. So I thought, well, I'll just use that as a target. And I have certain things that I write every day. I write gratitude in there. Gratitude is incredibly important in dealing with any kind of loss. I write what brought me joy the day before, so I can always be thinking about that. I write who's inspiring me today. I write about what I need to know today. And that's not a to-do list. It's a what do I need to know to make this day the best it can be. And I write another thing that's called Ho'oponopono, which I've seen in different ways, not just the Hawaiian tradition that we have here that most people have heard about, but other people have adopted the same basically 4 sentences that they use. It's a form of forgiveness and expressing gratitude and love. And I write that in my journal every day, especially if there's somebody that I feel I need to work on our relationship. I do that. And I also do it for the world. I'm doing it right now for the uh, ongoing wars that are happening,
Yeah.
to send out love and support to those people. And it worked for Nelson Mandela. He was in Robben Island for, I think, over 30 years in this prison. And I actually had the opportunity to go there and see the cell where he was kept for all those years. And his story was, at the beginning, when he first went in, he was reviled by the people that were the guards and the people that worked there. And it's in South Africa, you were always either on one side or the other. So he was on one side, and all the people that were taking care of him were on the other side. So they took that opportunity to be horrible to him, deprive him of food, beat him, uh, say horrible things to him, make it so that he couldn't sleep. All these things that would just make his life miserable. And he decided that the best way that he could deal with that was with love, to just not accept it. And so what he did is not respond when they were doing that sort of thing. And every day he would be focusing on, these people don't really know what they're doing. and I can love them for who they are and not blame them for what they're doing, because they don't know what they're doing,
Hmm.
because it's not helping them. It's not helping anybody else. And what happened was, gradually the guards started kind of liking him, which led to respecting him, which led to no more beatings. It led to having adequate food. It led to them becoming his protectors from other things that happened in the prison. And then after he got out, when he became president of South Africa, he actually had those guards as his bodyguards. And it was all because of how he put out his love, his forgiveness,
Right.
his gratitude toward these people. And I actually, when I went to visit there, the men who would do the tours were former prisoners who had become his bodyguards. And listening to them talk about him, you would think he was the highest form of human being that ever walked the earth.
Yeah, I assume they probably were waiting for him to cave in to
Mm-hmm.
meet their energy, and he rose to a higher level and brought them up.
Yeah. And that's what we can do. As
Yeah.
we rise to a higher level, we can bring up around us the things that aren't serving us now.
Yeah, I think the biggest roadblock for anyone to be gracious is, I guess, self victimization. Placing ourselves in a victim mode, and rather than empowering ourselves. I guess on the subject of death, we first become a victim of the circumstances of what's took place, how we're left and we're lost at some level. I guess it would
Mm-hmm.
be an innate child feeling of like being left or abandoned. And then I guess the grown up has to stand forward, I assume, and then take charge and then start to live and realize that life goes on. And as we were saying before, life is short, and we sometimes lose track of that because we don't think we're going to die. But the examples I guess you presented and what you were impacted by were firsthand to make, I guess, speed things up a bit, right? I guess evolution. Let's speak a little bit about your book. Um,
Okay.
and the different, maybe just the different chapters. I didn't get a chance to read it, but I definitely will. And I know it's transformational in regards to helping people in the grieving process itself, incorporating love.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. It's focusing on all what's good and positive, and not dwelling on things that are negative. And there's 26 chapters in it, so there's 26 different things that you can use. One of them, we hear gratitude mentioned all the time, but gratitude makes a huge difference. It's after Jacques died, one of my friends suggested that I write down a list of things I was grateful for. And I said, crazy, my husband died. What am I grateful for?
right.
And then somebody else suggested the same thing. And I always try to pay attention to when I have something come to me from the same thing from two different sources to check it out. So I thought, well, okay, all right, I'll try. And so my goal was to write 10 things that I was grateful for. And when I wrote 10, I was kind of surprised. I thought, wow, my life's not as bad as my mind was leading me to believe.
Right. Right.
And so I thought, well, what else am I grateful for? And I've said addicted to writing gratitude because every time I think of something, oh, I'm grateful for that, I'd write that down too. And I got carrying a little journal in my purse. So wherever I was, I'd be able to not forget something that I was grateful for. And I found the more gratitude I felt, the more I smiled, the lighter I felt, the more I realized that life wasn't this deep, dark, sad place that I'd been sitting in. And that whenever something started to not feel so great, I knew I could turn to that. I could flip back in my gratitude journal and go, wow, my life's pretty good to have all these things that I'm grateful for.
Yeah.
And so I've got a whole chapter on gratitude in my book and how much it's helped me.
How has the book helped you in itself? I mean, in terms of writing it.
It helped me. Well, I'll tell you why I wrote the book to start off with. Several months after my husband Ron died, a good friend of his who was much younger dropped dead. wasn't sick. Nobody anticipated it or anything. And they'd been family friends of ours when we lived on the mainland. And he had teenage daughters, and they were so much younger. He was enough younger than my husband that he called my husband dad. So that kind of puts things in perspective. And I was so concerned for his wife, because I knew that she wouldn't have thought about handling this sort of situation at all, because you just assume that's way down the road before you're going to be thinking about that. So I immediately wrote her a letter that I to her, I suggested, these are the things that you need to think about right now, and these are the things that you don't have to deal with right now. And got it to her within hours after he died. And she let me know later how valuable that was to her, because nobody else was talking to her about things like that. Everybody else was saying something like, "I'm sorry for your loss," which is not helpful. And she said, what I said was actually helpful to her. And I thought, well, I've got to do more than this. So I decided I'd send her a card every week for the first year. So I sat down and thought, well, if I'm going to write 52 things, I better be sure I've got 52 different things that I can say before I get started on this project.
Right, right.
So I made this list of 52 different things that you could think of that you're dealing with in grief. And this book has the first 26 of them, and my next book, which is already written, has the other 26 things, because I realized once I had that list that I had an outline for a book. So I got an agent and got a publisher and got the book out. And people have been saying that it helps them so much. It's like a companion or a guide, and they know they can flip to the chapter that what they're dealing with at that point, and get some suggestions and some comfort from.
Yeah, again, people, like, once they're in the mindset of grief, it almost becomes sometimes a shield for a person to live and exist in, as opposed to dealing with the feelings. And I
That's
think
right.
your book opens up the door for a way of handling it in a loving and compassionate way. Whereas, I've had experiences with people who've passed away, and I understand, like, for example, on Facebook, somebody passes away, a person will write, "Sorry for your loss, rest in peace." If you knew the person and you could recognize a trait or something that you shared with the person to validate that experience, it hits home, and it opens up, the heart. Whereas most people just close off and make it like a solemn type of encounter.
And I think why it bothers me so much is because I heard that more than anything else, and I felt like people were using it as an excuse to not have to talk to me. And I would have loved to have had somebody not have to talk to me, just sit there and hold my hand, or listen to me, or say something about the person who died. Because that's one thing that people tend not to do, is mention who died or what they've lost. And that sends a signal that it's not okay to talk about that.
Right, right.
And that might be exactly what you needed to hear. Like Jacques was, he taught philosophy at the college, but he also was a fabulous singer and good actor. And I loved it when people would say, "Oh, I love to hear Jacques sing." I'd go any place I knew that he was going to be singing, because I just loved his voice. That's so much better than "I'm sorry for your loss," you know?
Yeah, I think people reciprocate things that they're comfortable with receiving themselves or not receiving. Most most
Mhm.
of most of society, again, I think, is closed off to death and the subject of it, and so they don't want to hear anything solemn, because we're taught that if you're reminded of death or of somebody who passed away, you're going to be sad, and we look at it as like a never-ending cycle, but that's not the case. It needs to be expressed and released in order to be healthy and to move forward. And I think that's one of the greatest things that we can learn from, I guess, death, no, and passing or grieving, is that it's not it's we're here, and we can overcome it, and we can live our life. And you're an example of that, of all the things that you've gone through. I know that you have a project, which relates to the doorway into the light. Is that
Um,
something that is that something that you do, or?
well, Doorway into Light is something that's here on Maui. It's a project that's going on Maui,
Right.
where they help people with the dying process. They deal with the death itself. They deal with alternative burial forms, and or whatever you want to have done
Yeah.
after. after you die. And it's really nice to have alternatives like that. So it's a group that I support because they're so supportive.
Yeah.
My big project that I'm working on right now is called the Grief and Happiness Alliance. And that's something that I created to be a weekly Zoom meeting for anybody who wants to come, where we write about dealing with grief together. We all give a subject and we'll all write some, and then we'll talk about it. And we'll also learn happiness practices to give us something that can help us smile and feel better and be able to take a breath and not just stay in that dark place that you can fall into.
I'd like to join that
And
group.
oh, please do. It meets every Sunday, and I can send you a link to sign up.
Sure.
And I wasn't sure whether it seemed like it was a really good idea to me, but I wasn't sure anybody else would think it was. So I brought quite a few people together in a pilot program where I told them what I wanted to do, and then I did like a sample gathering that this would be like what you would experience. And then after we did all that, we got together and they all thought it was a good idea, that they wanted me to go forward with it. And I said, well, my problem is it costs money to do things like this. And I'm not comfortable with charging people to help them deal with grief. It just seemed wrong. And they suggested, well, then we'll just form a nonprofit organization and we will get the funding that can pay to support people coming to this. So it has value. It's not like something that you go to for free. It's something that you go to because you're being supported by somebody who cares about you.
Yeah. Well,
And so anybody can
I guess
come.
sharing company with other people who are at least knowledgeable or at least on the path to living their lives in their power, but
Mhm.
also sharing parts of themselves that are not whole makes people more complete. I know for myself, I mentioned before divorce, I know other men who've gone through divorce and having children. That's like I mean, while death is final in terms of bodily, you know, in terms of soul moving forward or going on, I believe that takes place. But in terms of like living on this plane and having the experience of separation from things you love and not being able to attach yourself or to interact at different times and going through the lesson or the journey of that um, was difficult or is difficult. So I think that's a grieving process where the remnants of it, I guess, just like death, remain,
Mhm.
but you're reminded of it more so in some cases, I guess, because it's in your presence. But then again, as you've gone through your experience and written these books and shared your insight, I think the greatest lesson that we all have is we're all on our own personal journey to discover our own true power, and the different types of stresses or uh, things we experience will definitely awaken us to what our purpose is. And I think your purpose of writing and sharing your wisdom or insight into grieving and how to overcome grieving, or how to actually not overcome grieving, but how to live your power, how to live your life in spite of the stresses and the things we lose. Um, yeah, it's insightful. Is there anything you just want to share regarding the subject that we've been talking about, or anything you want to leave the audience with as it relates to um, gratitude, and or which is probably
Yeah, that's a big one. What I like people to think about and to know that how things turn out for them ultimately is a choice, because you might have a circumstance that happens, but it's your choice in how you deal with it. And if you come from a place of love and loving yourself and forgiving yourself for whatever you need to forgive yourself for that has to do with it, that can open you up to a beautiful rest of your life. And I strongly encourage people to do that. You can get there with journaling, with talking to other people, or with just meditating and focusing on the fact that you're good, you're a
right.
good person, you deserve a good life, and you can live in the moment and enjoy every one of them.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you very much for your inspiring insight. I'll share all your information with my audience, and thank you for joining me today. It was a very, very nice
Thank you for having
conversation for
me.
me. Thank you.
Thanks.